Okay. Kitqanaqsimatsimaqpoa. This is going to be the first part of a two-part lecture on the second lunar cycle of the winter in the Blackfoot Phenology series. This cycle is called Iitaohkanaikokotoyi Niitahtaistsi, when the rivers freeze entirely over. And in a very loose and general way, this lunar cycle corresponds with the month of November in the Gregorian calendar. And I say loose and general because a lot of times, in a lot of years, Iitaohkanaikokotoyi Niitahtaistsi, the first sliver of this moon, doesn't occur until mid-November. And then the last sliver doesn't disappear until mid-December. So but it is in this general time frame. You can really tell that the mainstream Western calendar was anchored in an indigenous knowledge tradition that emphasized lunar time. And this is why you have these months, these 12 months of the year. Those are the 12 moons. But the Catholic Church, being more kind of patriarchal in interest, decided at one point to make those lunar cycles static on the calendar and focus instead on the solar year and the number of days in the solar year. So now you have these static months, and you have a certain number of days in the year, right? And this carries over into, even today, into science, into mainstream science. If you're a biologist in the current system, and you're plotting phenological events, you're going to do it on the solar calendar. So, for instance, in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the snow geese. If I was a mainstream biologist and I was studying the phenology of the snow geese, I would be paying attention to when their migrating flocks arrived at a certain place, and I'd be plotting that on the Gregorian calendar. Maybe they arrive at, Sterling Lake on November 2nd. But in Blackfoot phenology, the emphasis is on the lunar side of things. And so you're looking at what lunar cycle the snow geese arrive in, and in what part of that lunar cycle, the beginning, the middle, the end of it, And really, when it comes down to it, neither of these systems is best to use alone. It's not best to focus on the lunar over the solar or the solar over the lunar, because different plant and animal behaviors are timed. Some of them are timed based on lunar cycles, and some of them are timed with solar cycle. And so it's foolish, if you want to be a really good phenologist, to not have both. But right now, the mainstream only has its one way, and the Blackfoot system has always been focused on the lunar. So I'm advocating a kind of a merge between the two, and certainly at least a reacquaintance with the lunar. So what happens in this lunar cycle? Well, the main event, obviously, by the name of this lunar cycle, Iitaohkanaikokotoyi Niitahtaistsi, is that the rivers completely freeze over. Each of the lunar cycles in the Blackfoot tradition are named after what's considered to be the most important event, the highlight event of that cycle. It doesn't mean it's the only event and the only thing that's paid attention to, not by far. But, the defining characteristic, or the defining event of that cycle is what the name comes from. And this is the one cycle of the Blackfoot lunar year that might need to change in the future, because in this era of global warming, it is coming to be that during this lunar cycle, Niitahtaistsi Lecture, the rivers are not freezing entirely over. At least as I'm recording this, a quarter of the way into this lunar cycle in the year 2016 on the Gregorian mainstream calendar, this afternoon it's 17 degrees Celsius outside, and the still waters are not anywhere close to freezing over, not to mention the moving waters like the rivers. And last year, this lunar cycle played out similarly. The waters did eventually freeze over toward the end of the lunar cycle, but it was close. And I don't know if we're going to have a freeze over for this lunar cycle this year. We'll see. It's yet to be seen. But with global warming, it's a possibility that this will change, and that the freeze might not come until the next lunar cycle, the third lunar cycle of winter. So things are shifting around. One thing that is still happening this time of year that hasn't really changed is one of the Blackfoot weather prognostications, which is a red sunrise. When you see a sunrise where the clouds are all painted red, it's called Iitaohkanaikokotoyi or Niitahtaistsi. Both of these speak to red morning, basically. In Blackfoot, there's two shades of red that are in the language. Meekot, or meek, is one, which is more like a kind of iron color, and moch, which is more a pinkish red. So you could call this kind of a sunrise by either of these terms, Iitaohkanaikokotoyi or Niitahtaistsi. They both indicate the same thing, which is that there's going to be heavy winds that day, that occur that day. So this prognosticator is still occurring during this lunar cycle, and other parts of the year as well, but a lot during this lunar cycle, and it's still accurate. In fact, this photograph was taken just a few days before recording this lecture, and this was taken by my friend Charlene Burns of Babb, Montana, and sure enough, we had the heavy winds that afternoon, as tradition says we would. So that's something that is still consistent. Why that happens, I don't know. But it does. So what is occurring, and you'll notice that, as I go through the lectures on each of these lunar cycles, I'm going to include some weather phenomenon at the beginning of each lunar cycle. I'll talk about some weather phenomenon that's kind of related to that cycle, because each of the lunar cycles do have weather phenomenon that are more associated with them, and some are named after those weather phenomena. Like at one point, we're going to get into Misamsota, the long rains in summer. In any case, this lunar cycle is named after the freezing of waters, and so as we begin the cycle, typically things at my site at Spopikimi look like this, where the edges of the pond, of the oxbow, the still water. The edges are starting to freeze up. You can see a couple of feet of ice, 2-3 feet of ice coming off of the cut banks, extending toward the middle of the pond. And this, of course, is Xiskstakiuyas, the beaver lodge. And you can see their large food cache that they have been building through the 2 previous lunar cycles, and that they'll continue to build in this lunar cycle until the waters freeze over. So at the beginning of the lunar cycle, of this one, it's usually open like this. Waters are still fairly open. You might have some ice along the edges of the still waters. But by maybe the mid-moon, this might be all frozen over, or mostly frozen over. And the rivers, the moving waters, will start to get ice on them. And usually it takes this shape at first. Again, you have ice creeping in from the edges toward the middle, and then you've got this kind of slushy ice moving down the river, and eventually that all links together and forms a solid sheet. And it gets thick enough here most winters that you can walk across the river. There are still going to be some open crags, especially where you have springs, or in the urban areas now, where you have warm waters moving out of wastewater treatment and such. And so those warm open water crags are allowing a lot of waterfowl, like thousands of Canada geese and at least some mallards and such, to stick around all winter, where in the past they would have flown south. Now, one of the things to mention here is that it's at least interesting to note that water has this kind of magical quality that a lot of other, elements don't have. Water is one of the very, it might even be the only one that we know of, I'm not sure, but usually when a liquid turns into a solid, it becomes more condensed and more dense. In the case of water, though, when the liquid water forms into ice, the solid form, the ice is less dense. And so because of that, the ice only occurs at the top of the water. It doesn't freeze right to the bottom. And if it were any other way, if it didn't have that magical quality, we could not have life here. Because all the water would freeze all the way through, and all the organisms in that water would freeze. The cells would be destroyed. Life could not exist. So it's only because water has this quality, this magic quality. It defies the physics of the other elements, where solidification normally means densification. Water doesn't have this. Water is opposite. And so with that, we are able to have life here. And water is very important. In the Blackfoot system, there are references, especially with the beaver songs and such, to the significance of water. And in fact, the water defines Blackfoot territory. It's the rivers, not the land. It's the waters, not the land, that define the territory. And this is the way it is throughout North America, actually, indigenous North America. Waters form the political boundaries. And it's not even appropriate, I don't think, to call them political boundaries, because really they were more thought of as ecological life way boundaries. So the Blackfoot way of life only fits within the boundaries of the double lodge that is formed by the Upper Missouri and Upper Saskatchewan drainage basins. I was recently asked how you would talk about this concept that water is life. because in our era, today there's all kinds of political issues over water, as waters are contaminated or threatened by different industrial development projects. So somebody wanted to know, how do you speak of water being life? And my response was that if I was going to speak about the quality of water and what it means to us, I would actually reference back to the loon song. In the loon song is oh hey oh hey oh hey 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 Matsi sepio me kyawani ayo ma hey oh hey oh hey hey Achki ayo ma hey hey Nois dominanyo mo hey hey. And it goes on. But what it's saying there is the water is our body. It's our body. So it's that important to us. Rather than the water is life, the water is our body. Life takes a combination of the water and the radiance, the moon and the sun. So it's good to have both. And as the waters freeze over during Iitaohkanaikokotoyi Niitahtaistsi, the waterfowl are isolated from their food, so they have to move on. It's not the cold itself, in general at least, that prompts the great migration south of so many species. It is the food availability. It is the freezing over of the water that brings this about. And so you see the great migration occur, and you can still see this today. If you go to some of the lakes, and the waterfowl have favorite lakes, by the way. They don't just do this at every lake. Well, you can see some of them at every lake, but you can't see like this, where you have a giant raft of mallards on the lake. You're not going to see that at every lake. I see the waterfowl as socially organized, much like people. In fact, they may have inspired the way, in some respects, that people are socially organized. I see waterfowl as families, clans, tribes, nations, and as you watch the migration build up, some of the what you see is really the size of nations, giant masses. Particularly here, we see that with the snow geese. Iitaohkanaikokotoyi speaks to the black-tipped wing feathers, or the black-tipped wings. Iitaohkanaikokotoyi. So by the time the snow geese reach here and they have their favorite lake, which in my area is Tyrrell Lake. Tyrrell is near Milk River, just on the Alberta side of the international line. And there, the snow geese form huge rafts of thousands of geese. I mean, this is a really big lake. It's hard to tell from the photograph. But you'll see a third up to a half of the lake just filled with these snow geese. And when you watch them come in, you'll see thousands and thousands arrive at one time. And they don't, if 6,000 geese arrived in this photo right now, or it just flew in here and landed amongst those that are already there. They wouldn't make a significant change to the image, because that's how many geese are here. There's just tens of thousands of geese. And what I see there also is that there is usually a part of the lake at this particular Tyrrell Lake. It's the southern end of the lake. There's a little marsh where the injured will be secluded, because the migration does take its toll. So as you're flying in these gigantic flocks, moving around so close to one another, there are accidents. And sometimes birds get hurt. It's usually the younger ones, the ones that were born this year, that get injured, get broken. So I have found snow geese at the south end of this lake at the marsh, isolated with broken legs. And there's usually eagles, coyotes on hand who also are aware of this and go there to feed. On one occasion, I took one of these snow geese myself that was injured with the. I didn't know what its injury was at first, so I thought, well, I'll go pick it up, and if it's an injury that can't be mended, a broken wing, for instance, then I'm going to have goose for dinner. But if it's something else, then I'll try to help the animal. It turned out to be a broken leg, and I was able to mend the goose back into health and send it on its way before the last of the migrating nation of snow geese had left. So, yeah, we still see these giant events, but a lot of people alive today who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s remember this time of year as being much more impressive than it is today. My father-in-law, for instance, remembers being able to lay down on the grass in the prairie and watch up at the sky, and for hours at a time, the birds would just be passing. And that's not happening today. In the old days, the Iitaohkanaikokotoyi, the beaver people, would train young people to in species recognition and in the phenology, and they would have them watch the birds in their migration and watch the sequence, because at a certain point in the sequence, they would know that there were storms coming. A lot of that knowledge is lost today, needs to be regained, if it can be regained. But at certain points in the migration sequence, there was indication by the birds that were passing of storms to come. One of the ways that was understood is as far as I was told, is that when birds started migrating low in the sky, like say you saw the snow geese come past and they were flying very low, this is an indication that the temperatures above where they would normally be flying in their migration are too cold for them. And this might be an indication of a coming storm. And so they would warn people. But they also position themselves, because in the days of the bison, when the early winter storms came, like the Magpie that we talked about in Niitahtaistsi, when the early winter storms came, they were usually wet, cold, dangerous storms, And just like the people retreating off of the prairies into the coulees, into the river bottoms for shelter from these storms, so too would the bison move into these areas. And so a lot of hunts were timed based on the storms. As soon as the storm was done, the bison were hunted in the coulee areas. This is my understanding. As part of the migration, we have a lot of these, like the snow geese, for instance. They just pass through. They're never staying here in Blackfoot territory. So they're not here in summer, they're not here in winter, but they just pass through at the beginning and end of the season. A lot of our birds that are here during the summer will leave south for the winter, but we also get new birds in from the north who will stay here for the winter. One of those is this bird, who is Kistsipimisa, the spotted duck, or the speckled duck in Blackfoot. And this is the common goldeneye in English. So this is one of our winter ducks that comes in. And this is a fish-eating diving duck. This is the male of the species. The female looks a bit different. And during this lunar cycle, they'll start to arrive. So you should see your first Kistsipimisa X at your site. You should keep an eye out for them, because this is one of the phenological events to be watching. When do they show up at your site each year? They should show up sometime during the cycle. At what point, though? You should be paying attention to this. I was able to have a winter where I was close to one of these golden eyes. For some reason, one of these males had ended up in a parking lot. He may have mistaken the concrete for a body of water. I don't know, but he ended up in a parking lot in a kind of a fugue state. He didn't seem to be injured, but something was wrong with him. He may have crashed into something and had a little concussion. I don't know, but in any case, somebody found him and brought him to me, and so he stayed in my bathtub for about 6 weeks. And I fed him. I would buy schools of minnows and release him in the bathtub, and he would eat them so fast, just swimming underwater and scooping up the minnows. So I got to see, really close what I often see on the rivers. And, these guys will stay in the open crags on the rivers and go around and eat the minnows. Now, before we had as many open crags as we do today, I don't know whether they would have had to go further south or not, probably. But certainly they're one of our winter birds now. And you'll be able to recognize also the sound of their flight. They have a whistle, a whistling sound when they're flying. And so as you go through, your first winter of observation here, you'll most definitely hear that sound and be able to come to associate it with the golden eyes. One of the smaller, like passerine type birds who doesn't move out until kind of later in this lunar cycle, but eventually does, is the pine grosbeak. This is the only time of the year that I actually see them down at Spobikimi, at my site. This is a female pine grosbeak. Here's what a male looks like. Yellow and red, hey? Yellow for the female, red for the male. And they're eating the seeds of a Manitoba maple tree. And I just have a couple of these trees at Spobikimi. but the birds, the grosbeaks, know about them, and so um, they come and they strip the tree of the seeds during this lunar cycle. Some years I catch them there. Other years the tree will have its seeds, and then one day, and then I'll go back. 5 days later, all the seeds are gone, and I know they've been visited by the grosbeaks. They tend to stick around in the neighborhoods and be more synanthropic, living around people, eating the seeds of trees in the neighborhoods and the suburbs. Most of the time, they just make their way to Spilbeekimi specifically for these maple seeds. And this is one of the birds that I don't have a Blackfoot name for. And so, there are several birds like this. Probably the vast majority of birds we don't have Blackfoot name for anymore. And this is a project where they're going to need to be given new names. And one of my students, when I was working at Red Crow College, was working with the elders on a special project to do some of that renaming as research within the program I was running. Another bird, a small passerine that also we don't have the Blackfoot name for anymore, is the American tree sparrow. This is a bird who's going to stick around all winter. This is one of our year-round residents. And they're mostly seed eaters in the winter. In the summer, they get a little bit more diversity. They'll eat some berries, they'll eat some small flowers, some insects. But in the winter, they're seed eaters, and you'll see them mostly feeding on the ground, kind of poking around on the ground looking for little seeds. Another winter resident that we didn't have in summer are the Bohemian Waxwings. Their Blackfoot name is Simitsim, which refers to their kind of grayish color, which is like the color of a well-used teepee cover. One that's had a fire in the teepee for a long, many lunar cycles, and it's kind of taken on this grayish tone from the smoke. That's what Simitsim is referring to. And this is the Blackfoot name for all of the waxwings, by the way. So in the summertime, we have Bohemian, or we have cedar waxwings here. And in the winter, we have the Bohemian waxwings. And the Bohemian are more gray. They lack some of the yellow that the cedars have. But in either case, there's just the one Blackfoot name for them, Simitsim. And so I don't know whether or not there was a recognition that there's actually two different species in the past, because their presence here is seamless. As the Bohemians are moving in, the cedars are leaving. So there's never a time here really without waxwings. And they look very much alike, although they are distinguishable for sure. It may have been thought by the people in the past that it was just a different plumage for the season, and this is why they just have the one name. I don't know. This is conjecture, but they do just have the one name, Simitsim, and these guys are berry eaters, in large part, and they will clean off berry bushes like this time of year. Iitaohkanaikokotoyi Niitahtaistsi. They're moving around mostly to the bullberries, and they will sit up at the tops of the cottonwood trees in large groups, sometimes many hundreds of birds, even thousands, but generally in at least a good-sized flock. And part of their flock will move down onto the berry bushes below and eat until they're full, and then grab an extra berry and fly back up onto the cottonwoods. They'll feed one of their berries to one of the other birds that's up there waiting, and then those birds that are fed, that get the berries, it's their turn to fly down. And they'll do this until basically until they've cleaned off the bushes. And so for me, it's always kind of a challenge, actually, to get the bullberries when they're perfectly ripe before the Bohemian Waxwings get to them and clean them out. But they stick around all winter. We'll see Simit all winter. Another bird that sticks around, that's here year-round, actually, is the Downy Woodpecker. And they are a very common sight in the riparian forests. You should definitely see Downy Woodpeckers at your site if you're in Blackfoot territory. And the Blackfoot name for these birds are in general Bachbuxxisi. Bachbuxxisi refers to the hammering with their nose. Hammering with their beak. Well, nose. It's the same. In Blackfoot, there's no separate word for beak. It's just the nose. And this, again, is another situation where the name, the Blackfoot name, Bachbuxxisi, crosses a species boundary. Because not only the Downy woodpeckers are called this, but also the hairy woodpecker, which looks exactly like the downy, with just a little bit heavier, beak, but the plumage and everything is otherwise the same. It may have been, and this again is just conjecture, it may have been in the past that there wasn't a recognition actually that there are two different species, as there is today from the studies in biology and ornithology. We know that there's two different species, but in the past they may have just been considered one, Bachbuxxisi. And as woodpeckers, of course, these guys are roaming the forests, eating insects from the trees. You'll see them a lot of times moving around with flocks of chickadees, who seem to be their friends. And you'll see them picking insects off the bark and also hammering for grubs that are inside of the tree. And you'll find their cavities, their cavity nests, which they do still occupy for the nights during the winter. So you'll see them moving in and out of their cavities. This is one of the birds that continues to use their nests through the season as a shelter. Bachbuxxisi. Another one of the winter birds that's not here in the summer, but who arrives during this lunar cycle, and one that you should look out for, is Apaksoatsimi. Apaksoatsimi means a wide tail. Apaksoatsimi. Some people say Ipaksoatsimiop. The rough-legged hawk. This is a winter bird of prey in Blackfoot territory that goes north again in summer, and he's really built for the cold weather. The reason he's called rough-legged is because he's got feathers going all the way down, his feet onto his toes, just like the snowy owl who will arrive in the next lunar cycle. But you should already be able to see Iitaohkanaikokotoyi in Iitaohkanaikokotoyi Niitahtaistsi, especially if you're going down the highways, because a lot of times, like in this image, of course, he's on a power pole. This is where you'll normally see them. You're not going to find them in the forests and such, in the riparian areas, probably not at some of your sites. But as you're moving through Blackfoot territory, you should definitely encounter them. And the most distinguishing kind of physical characteristic to look for is basically the white hood. They have so much white on their head, and the white hood extends down their breast. So you look for that white hood. And this is the rough-legged hawk. Another year-round resident, I'm sure you guys recognize, Niitahtaistsi, the black-billed magpie. By far my favorite bird. Niitahtaistsi used to be very, very close to humans. Very, very close. They used to be our hunting partners. There's a story, a Napi story about the first marriage. And in that story, both Niitahtaistsi and Niitahtaistsi, the crows, are featured. And they say that the crows used to be the pets of the men, and the Niitahtaistsi would be the pets of the women. And what they meant by pets, this is of course an English translation, was that these were animal allies. It wasn't that they were necessarily caged or these kind of things or kept, but they were very close to the people. And when Lewis and Clark traveled through Blackfoot territory, one of the things that they wrote about in their journals was the way that the magpies would come walk into their tents without any fear and eat from their hands. And so this, I think, speaks to the kind of intimacy and the kind of relationship that we had with the magpies, before the newcomers arrived. And the newcomers arrived with biases, demonization against certain species. The crows, the magpies, the wolves, all of them were considered bad, in the European traditions. And so there began, when the newcomers arrived, a persecution of these animals here that still hasn't ended, by the way. But the magpies, I find, are waiting for us. They're watching us, and they're waiting for us to become more human. And if you pay attention to the magpies at your site, they will notice, and they will begin to guide you. Unfortunately, a lot of what they'll guide you toward is something that you can't do anything about. You can't reciprocate the way that they want you to. And what I mean by that is that they're going to tell you where there are deer bedded down. They will go perch above the deer, and they'll give a triple call, what, that tells you that something's there. They're telling on the deer. Or it could be a rabbit. It could be something. And the magpies are wanting you to go over there and kill that deer, so that you'll take your part and leave them their part, right? And so we no longer keep that relationship for the most part, right? And as a result, the magpies in the winter, these birds have evolved, I think, with us. They're synanthropes to the max. They are a species that lives with humans. And they've evolved such that they can't, I think that the way that their feathers are, they can't even fly south, not even if they wanted to, for more resources. They just can't fly long distances. They haven't needed to. They've always lived so closely with humans. And in the winter, humans used to give them food, used to kill the animals that the magpies would lead them to. Now we don't do that. And so what I see at my site is that in order to survive the winter, and I will be showing this in some of the future lunar cycles, the magpies have to literally eat shit to survive the winter. because we're not acting like human beings, they will eat the excrement of coyotes and some of the other more carnivorous species in order to survive. Now, of course, with me, when we're in the winter, I do try to reciprocate for their help. I mean, I've learned a lot from the magpies. I've learned a lot. I've tried to help the magpies. I've taken in injured magpies and taken care of them. Right now I have 3 magpies living at my house, as well as 3 crows. But having magpies at the house, I also end up having, that magpies around my home take notice. And some of them, I've had some very close relationships with some of them as well. And out at my site, at Spopikimi, I also try to groom the relationship, and I learn a lot from them. You know, even when they're not trying explicitly to show me things, which they will do. If I'm paying attention to them, I will also learn, for instance, insect events. A lot of the insect phenology I would not know if it weren't for the magpies leading me to those events, for me seeing the magpies at a certain place, picking amongst the leaves or picking in the grass, picking on the water, on the ice. Then I know to go look, and inevitably I find that there's an insect phenological event going on that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. So the magpies are one of the birds that I really try to, reciprocate for their help. And I make offerings in the way of, sapunstan, whether I've had help from them recently or not. I'll feed them. I'll bring them meat, especially in the times when other food is very lean in the winter, when they're having to eat shit. I'll bring them meat. A lot of times I'll bring them delicacies. Even I'll go buy innards. I'll buy kidneys and livers and things like this that are very rich meats, and I'll bring them for the magpies to eat, as you see here. This is what a magpie nest looks like. It is the most intricate nest, I think, in Blackfoot territory, and it takes them over a month to build it. Most birds, it takes a day or 2 for them to build their nests. Magpies, it takes over a month because it's very complex. It's a large orb. Lots of sticks, lots of twigs incorporated, and then they also make a mud bowl inside, and then they line the mud bowl, at my sites at least, with chokecherry stems from the previous season. And they reuse these nests. They reuse them. So one of the things that happens, of course, during this lunar cycle is that all the leaves are falling off of the trees. And so a lot of nests are revealed. And one of the things that I advocate for studying kind of the ecology of your site, as well as just getting to know who's there, is to go around and survey the nests. Look at the nests. Look at what they're made of. Look at how they're made. Pay attention to the animal architectures. They're important. So I've gone around my site and I've begun to learn. I haven't learned all of the nests by far, but I've learned quite a few. Of course, magpie nests are easy to identify. I've learned how to identify catbird nests, and I've taken them apart. Like, catbirds do not reuse their nests, so a lot of the little passerine nests like this you can remove if you'd like. I would look inside first and make sure that no mice are using it as a place to cache food or as a shelter to eat their food safe from predators. A lot of times you'll find these nests full of seeds that are being eaten by mice. If a mouse is using it, I wouldn't take it. But if there's no sign that anybody's using it, you could take it and carefully take it apart. A naturalist who I've read many of his books, Bernd Heinrich, has done careful studies of nests at his place, his site, which is in northern Maine, in the forest of northern Maine. And when he takes several nests from a particular species and takes them apart very carefully, he finds that often they're made with almost the exact same number of blades of grass or sticks or whatever elements. That it's not just the use of those elements alone, but an exact code of how many you use to build the nest. So it's very intricate. For me, I especially like to see which plants or which materials are used in the architecture, because I want to know what other species that bird is related directly to, so that you know if a certain species uses a certain kind of root and suddenly you don't have that root available to them anymore, you probably are not going to have that species around anymore. Either that or they're going to have to adapt and make use of something else completely. So look at the nests at your site. Survey the nests. It may take several years to kind of learn which birds belong to which nests. Some nests are very identifiable, very distinct. Others you may have some difficulty with. You may have to go through a summer season, learn the birds who are around in the summer, and then go into the winter, look at the nests, and use some of the different field guides for bird nests to kind of figure out whose is whose. There's a robin's nest in an opening in a cottonwood tree in the trunk. Robin's nests are one of those nests that are very distinct because of the mud bowl that they use and the size of the nest and the grass material that's used outside of that. Another nest that's very distinct is the orioles. I like to, once the leaves have fallen, I like to move through my site and survey the canopies of the cottonwoods for oriole nests. They are a hanging bag of fiber that you can see, quite distinctly if you're looking for them. And I like to make a count of how many are there, because one of the things that ornithologists are saying is that the orioles, the Baltimore orioles, they're the northern orioles, are sometimes called, are one of the species that is starting to, the population is going down. And so I like to see whether that is happening at my site, whether or not there's an indication that the species is decreasing by counting the nests that are left there each year. And I've included in here this concept to learn when we're talking about these architectures of the other species. This is the concept that is the sister concept of the one that I introduced in the orientation for the phenology course when I talked about Saponstan, about trying to establish the conditions through offerings and through visiting and such that you will receive benefit, the greatest amount of benefit from your relationships out there at your sites. So while you're engaged in Saponstan, what we're looking for from the plants and animals is the other side of the relationship, which is Bomuksin, which is the transfer, the knowledge transfer from these other species to us. And in Blackfoot epistemological theory, we basically come to know things through relationships. Everything is about relationships. It's not about discovery. It's not about the individual, but it's about grooming relationships and gaining bomuks and transfers in the context of those relationships. And I see this as a truth, that knowledge is not produced out of thin air. Knowledge comes from relationships, even when it's not recognized. You know, when I see a bird's nest, to me, I highly suspect that our weaving technologies, our basketry, even the designs of pottery and such, I think it was learned from the birds. And so in the Blackfoot way, you give recognition for that, right? So you can, when you practice Atsumoitskan, which is a reciprocation in a relationship that's done through speech, you might, when you're speaking to birds, give them credit and gratitude, expression of gratitude for what they've taught us. They've taught us a lot. One of the things that we can learn a lot from is their architectures, and we have learned a lot from it, and I do think we still have a lot left to learn. They've taught us flight. You know, if you're ever inside of an airplane, tell me that's not a bird's body. You know, in the mainstream, in the Western science, so much has been learned from the animals. But because of the way that they approach the relationship, where they force, you know, where they put animals in laboratories and force the animals to give up their knowledge and put them through, you know, really torturous experiments. Because of the nature of that relationship, then the mainstream scientist does not see the animal as the giver of that knowledge. It's not grateful to the animal in the same way. As a result, doesn't recognize that he didn't discover anything, that it was transfers, bomuks, and that brought about that knowledge, and that bomuksin can be a source of improved relationships between human beings and other species. You know, and without that recognition of the bomuksin, we can go ahead and continue carrying on our destruction of, you know, the habitats and the lives of so many other species, that we would really have a much more ethical issue with, I think, if bomuksin and the idea behind this relationship dynamics was to become part of the mainstream narrative around how knowledge is developed. So yeah, I advocate for you at your sites to pay attention to animal technologies, not just their architectures, but everything that they make um, as a potential source of bomux. And when I look at a lot of where the knowledge that the animals have given to Blackfoot people is transferred to the successive generations. Like myself, I'm the recipient of transferred knowledge in the beaver bundle tradition, and all of that came from the animals. And where you get the kind of mnemonic triggers for that knowledge being transferred is mostly in the songs and in the ceremony itself. And in the songs, there is a lot of, for many species, it's noted that their home is sacred, where they sit. Niitahtaistsi Lecture, where I sit, is sacred, where I stay. Niitahtaistsi, where I stay and where I sit, that's synonymous in Blackfoot. It basically means your home. Your home is the sacred place. So for each of these species, I think that's the case. For most of them, the nests and the burrows and the dens, the places where they sit, are sacred places. And when they've gone through the trouble to construct them like this, we should be paying attention and learning from those, and learning from how they use those spaces too. So we'll stop there for part 1, and we will be moving in part 2, we will talk about what's going on with some of the mammals, what's going on with some of the insects, etc. Again,